Welcome to Politifunk. I'm your host, Drew Bradway. It's been, if my counter is anything right, 43 days since the last episode, and I would apologize, but I don't particularly care. I've been tied up with work things. As it turns out, once you have a degree, people, after a couple of months, want to hire you. So I've been moving through job offers, and that's a good problem to have. But that aside, we're back to talk about a number of things that just happened, and of course, it happens every single week. But in this week, in particular, there have been a couple of incidents that have been especially important. Not the least of which was a group of protesters who interrupted Bernie Sanders at a political event last weekend. But I won't get too much into that because that is, incidentally, the heart of the conversation. I have invited a guest whom I've never met nor had a real conversation with. And I say that only as a caveat in the sense that this is not someone that I've ever conversed with before. I'm not expecting anything good or bad, but someone I had a conversation online with, we were talking about this, and I felt like, well, this is a conversation we should really have. And of course, he invited me first, to be fair, to have a conversation face to face. And given that we have the affordance of the internet, this is the thing that I wanted to do. So special guest, if you could please introduce yourself.
How you doing? My name is Aaron Davis. I go by Aaron Datorian as a comic, but I'm also here to voice an opinion and speak on some solutions. Thank you for having me.
Oh, pleasure to have you. So we were talking about, if you haven't gotten caught up already, and this is the guest, if you haven't gotten caught up already, certainly just look up Bernie Sanders event, protest, or anything else like that. I'm not going to get into the particulars of that. It's something you can certainly research on your own. Google works, so do that. What we're going to be talking about at Aaron's behest, and of course, certainly with my agreement on it, is more broadly solutions. And I know that that seems impossibly broad, but what we're really addressing is sort of the predicament of Black people and sort of at large minorities, and what are the things that we can do to adjust, if not remedy that. Aaron, if you would, I'd love if you would go first. If you let me know how you feel about it.
I made a statement about the Black Lives Matter movement.
Right.
Recently, I called the matter trash, and I wanted to apologize because two people don't represent the entire movement. Now, the way I feel that the Black Lives Matter movement can move forward, we got a lot of things that we can approach things. And me personally, I don't believe that interrupting Bernie Sanders' protest was one of the best ways of doing it. We got a candidate that's actually out there trying to fight for, he actually has ties to the civil rights era. He's trying to fight for financial equality in America, and interrupting his platform, that was just kind of plain rude. Don't get me wrong, I understand protest, but there's better ways we can actually do things to have more of a stand and have a little more power politically. It was two women, and it was a couple of people yelling from the crowd. And I had to step back and realize that, yeah, they don't represent the entire movement, but I believe that they kind of put a dampen on what the movement should be at the moment.
That's fair. I could not disagree with you more, and I say that respectfully. And I'll explain. So on the one hand, right, I don't think that any protest movement really of any success has ever been strategic, and history bears that out. There's never been a group of people who said, these are the specific things that we want to accomplish, and we will do it by disobedience in a very particular way. Two, disobedience is by nature, civil disobedience is by definition rude. There's no polite way to protest. There just isn't. And then three, most importantly, the women who did what they did got things done. Within 48 hours, Bernie Sanders had refocused his protest. In terms of expedience, that really can't be argued. It happened. But beyond that, the idea of there being a respectable way of asking for equality or petitioning for, in any particular way, equality offends me. And I'm not saying your point of view offends me. I want to be clear. It doesn't. But that idea offends me. That we should go about things in a particular way, and that strategy is a thing, and I base that off of or I base that on the notion that if one is harmed civilly in any way, then a cry of anguish, however it comes out, not only is righteous by definition, but should be expected. There shouldn't be a particular way that one has to protest or declare any kind of grievance or whatever that should be finger wagged or called inappropriate, because straight up, those people aren't the ones that were perpetrating a wrong. They're reacting to it.
Okay, I understand reacting, and you know, when things upset you, you know, there's thousands of ways to react, and but you say civil, interrupting a man's speech, that's not really civil. And when we talk about civil disobedience, I think of like John Lennon having bed-ins where people didn't go out and they didn't buy anything, and next thing you know, the economy had to do something. I think of the Gen 6 movement, which I was a part in, where they said, you know what, this weekend don't buy shit. And that whole weekend we didn't buy nothing. And next thing I know, I watch commercials change, I watch ads change. That sounded like a better form of civil disobedience. Now, as far as these two women, I understand reacting, but I'm gonna say that is an ineffective way of reacting. Him changing his stance on it, that's just being a good politician. Obviously, if he felt it needed, when the Dylan Booth thing happened, I got an email immediately about the situation from Bernie Sanders. He's always been involved in issues like this, so it's nothing new to him. But if these people want to make a better stand in this movement, in the Black Lives Matter movement, we need more financial power and political power.
I think that doesn't make any sense to me. The idea that only people of a certain financial standing can make a statement or a valid political statement completely undermines the idea of protests to begin with. And more than that,
we're in a
but
capitalism.
No, there's nothing to do with capitalism. Look, every single time that poor people have been ignored, what did you have? A rebellion. Just ask France. Just ask Germany. Just any Western country at all, right? Now, I'm not saying that we are on the verge of that, right?
We're violent and bloody. I'm not saying things get violent and bloody. I'm just seeing speeches get interrupted. Now,
right, but even then, look, what I was going to say on the tail end of that, I was like, I'm not saying that we're at that point. But the idea that there should be a respectable way that we go about, or even a particular way that oppressed peoples go about becoming less oppressed, for me, that is offensive. And beyond that, too, even to say that what he did was what politicians do, we can make that same critique of the entire civil rights movement. Let's look at Brown versus Board of Ed, which is decided twice, and we still have segregated schools, right? That whole thing, you could say, oh, it was based on technically what we were saying about what was happening in Europe and with Russia and all that other kind of stuff, and we were being inappropriate in other countries.
Then let's look at the boycott of the buses. They boycotted for a year, right? They boycotted a long time. It took a community for people to get together and say, we ain't getting on the bus. Now, I'm out here in Cleveland, Ohio. Can you imagine black folks say, we sick of this shit, we not getting on the RTA? That's going to take a whole lot of people in that community to band together. Now, who's losing money at that time? The RTA. That's where, you know, when it comes to civil disobedience, that's when you're taking money out of someone's pocket, and that's how you get somebody's attention. I look at all these political.
Well, that's one way, though. That's one way. To marginalize and minimize and say every other way, but the way that is somehow strategic, or at least perceived to be strategic, is wrong, misses the point of protest entirely. I use the analogy of someone getting stabbed, right? If you get stabbed, and then you start screaming out in pain, and the EMTs show up, and or whoever, the paramedics, and you're screaming out in pain, and they critique you screaming out in pain, saying, well, that's not really helping me do my job, and you're really upsetting me and making me less able to do my job, misses the point of the scream entirely. It's not strategic. It is an alert, and in fact, it is mostly involuntary. It is a response to an offense and to really what constitutes an existential threat. So when someone has violated you, you do that. Now, in the case of Bernie Sanders, look, I recognize what the man has done. I don't diminish him at all. And in fact, them doing it, and if I believe they had been protesting Bernie Sanders himself, that'd be an entirely different issue. They were not protesting Bernie Sanders. They were protesting the man or the establishment, right? Bernie Sanders cannot get out from under being representative of that. You can't be a politician and then say, oh, but I'm not a politician, but I'm a politician, right? And it is a catch-22, but that's part of the game. That's just how it works out. So when they protest him and they interrupt him and then he makes an adjustment, that's further evidence of it. And more than that, though, it is not a critique of him individually. In the same way that we classify the entire movement as either being problematic or not, we can classify Washington or politicians as being problematic or not. And Bernie Sanders necessarily being a part of that, we don't have to look at him as an individual. We can say, all right, well, look, this man in particular has done great things, but politicos in general have not done good things. So them interrupting his movement, look, that event was not him at his house talking to someone about how he feels. It was a politician making, or was going to make, a political point of view public. That is necessarily representative of a larger point of view and not just his own. That was a campaign. You can't say then that was like, well, you shouldn't do that to him. Well, they didn't do that to him.
Well, let me ask this. People that are supporters of the Black Lives Movement, these two women interrupting his podium, do they feel they made progress? Do black people feel they made progress in the struggle?
I mean, they obviously did.
Like, to get him to redirect his movement, to say something about it, like, he's been doing this already. It's nothing new to him. That's what I'm saying.
No, but like, it is, though.
It's nothing new for Bernie to speak out against stuff like that. He's been speaking out for stuff like this.
But like, then why did he adjust his campaign, though? If what he was saying was legit before, what was the adjustment about? The refocus, I think, really highlighted what they were talking about. Again, this is not, what they did was not about Bernie Sanders personally. It was about how campaigns in particular, it doesn't matter if it was Bernie Sanders' campaign or not, how they ignore the concept of racial justice. They won't call it racial justice. They'll call it economic equality. They'll call it anything else but racial justice. And in particular, they ignore racism and systemic racism as a problem that has been a problem and at the root of our country's problems. And so what he did in acknowledging that was he straight up put racial justice as a platform like that.
But I mean, all I'm saying is, like, this is nothing new for this man.
But
like,
it is.
I've been looking at his track record. He's been doing this since the 70s. All I'm saying, what I'm saying here is that I understand they did it to Bernie. I want to see this happen to other politicians too.
And it has, though. Oh, and well, even if it didn't, the point is they didn't do it to Bernie. I think that's what you're missing. If you look at it as it happening to Bernie, then you have to pull him apart from the rest of the establishment. If it was specific to Bernie Sanders and they did it because, you know what, let's go get Bernie Sanders rather than them opportunistically taking advantage of a large campaign and doing that to that, because he is necessarily representative of the establishment. But if you make it personal, then
no, it's not personal. I'm just saying what you're saying is the only reason this happened is because they had the opportunity to use that platform and they basically just seized the opportunity.
I wouldn't say the only reason. I wouldn't be that presumptive, but yes, like, it's a large part of the reason. And more than that, I agree with you in terms of Bernie Sanders doing this for a long time. I'm not ignorant of that. Like, I'm aware. I admire the man. And in fact, when it comes down to it, if he becomes a candidate, I'm going to vote for him. But I also at the same time have to acknowledge that we cannot compartmentalize certain people who we deem, even individually or even as a movement or any other combination of disparate movements, as being advocates. Because yes, they are advocates, and yes, they have done well, but this has nothing to do in some ways with what they represent at large. So to put it a different way, right? Like, if you have, let's say you live in a neighborhood where you're being abused by cops, and you know a very good police officer lives in your neighborhood, right? When you go and protest at the police station, and that cop is there and he's the spokesman, Are you protesting that cop? Well, no, it's not him. You know he's a good guy, but you're protesting the systemic wrongs. You're protesting the larger thing that you're still being injured by, that he is in that position emblematic of. So it has nothing to do with that person personally. What they were saying, it wasn't like Bernie Sanders, you didn't do this or did do that.
I get the fact they wasn't, attacking him personally. It was
right.
just,
so then it makes sense to me.
Now, now I'm starting to understand that they just probably seized the opportunity. Oh, I can run up there and get on that mic, so I'm gonna go do it.
Right. And more, like for me, I get where you were coming from. Honestly, like we had the exchange or whatever, but I get where you were coming from on one hand, but on the other, more largely, like just speaking in terms of understanding how, not even how movements work. I'm not even gonna get there, but just we cannot put a behavioral requirement on oppressed groups and saying you have to behave in a particular way and you have to respect individuals of the oppressive class, even if they are really nice to you, or especially because they're really nice to you, because we don't get qualified as individuals in the same way until we're dead, right? We don't look at, oh, Drew in Manchester, Connecticut is being oppressed. We look at it as a larger group. Even the Black Lives movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, is not headed by a particular person. And it isn't because there aren't people who are doing more or less. It's because it's seen as Black people as a part of this movement and necessarily pro-Black, and that means necessarily inclusive of all Blacks. We don't see that about Bernie Sanders. We don't call Bernie Sanders a white leader, do we? No, I mean, we qualify him as an individual. And that's where the problem is. That's the issue I have. Not with Bernie Sanders, but with the way that we allow white people and white persons to be individualized and necessarily separate and qualified as persons, and us corralled together. And whenever we have a person step up and do something, all of a sudden it should necessarily be representative of us until we have somebody disqualify that. You've never heard a white person ever disqualify the KKK as if somehow it's part of a white movement, especially white movement. Not in that way. They've certainly said that they don't agree with it, but it's never been in distancing themselves from the white movement as a white leader, because you don't have that. But we are forced to do that. And that is the thing that I've been upset about, in particular about these protests. This particular protest is that we didn't look at them as three women who are paid to do this kind of thing. We necessarily made it a part of a movement. And even after we had evidence that it wasn't a part of a movement, we still were critiquing it as it was a part of the movement. That's the problem. That's when I said, like when I was talking to you about how race is constituted, that's how race is constituted, is that white people get to be individuals. White people get to stand alone and not have leadership and have autonomy, especially political autonomy. Whereas Black people are necessarily a group that necessarily need to be unified, that necessarily need to have all these other kinds of things that don't apply to the white majority. Those things don't apply. And yet we pretend as if somehow it's a political norm for oppressed persons to have to like muster strength together rather than being valid unto themselves. That's my big issue.
I feel where you're coming from on that one. I definitely do.
That's a good point.
Like, yeah. I don't think you're wrong. Nothing that you said was wrong.
Good point. I see where you come from. But, I was just offering my solutions of, I get what you mean. I understand what you mean. How do we fix it?
Okay.
What are stronger tactics? What are some of the stronger tactics we can actually get out of this rut? And one of the main things I was trying to explain, that's why I was trying to say, like, financial power, man. Financial power is so serious. It's a capitalist society. I understand that, been oppressed, but our dollar has a lot of power. Like, as far as Black power, that Black dollar, man.
But economically wise, we are only controlling maybe 1% of this economy's wealth when Europeans control predominantly about 89%.
Are you able to hear him?
Right. Yeah. And so I agree with that. Here's another thing, and I'm going to say this briefly. I know I'm long-winded. I'm going to try and make it very brief. I agree with you, and simultaneously, I don't see it as an either or kind of thing. Like, and I put it to you like this, because when I view oppressed persons, particularly Black people in America, if we're going to focus on that, might as well make it that. I don't see, like, if I'm being attacked, right? If I was walking down the alley and I was being attacked, I'm not going to try and strategize and think of what are the fewest amount and most powerful punches I can throw to get out of this. I'm going to flip out. And some of the things I do aren't going to make sense because I'm under attack. And after I've maybe in that barrage of attack, counterattacks I'm throwing back, I make some smart choices. But even if I don't make smart choices, it has to be understood when you're watching the playback of that tape or what have you, that that is a person under attack. So to suggest to them that they should pull back and be calm and strategize misunderstands, misconstrues the position that they're in. We're not in a position to say, all right, well, let's take more time and think this out and what's the best possible way of doing it. Some of us are, but some of us and other, even philosophical or psychological, whatever, have been wrong in a particular way where we're reacting to it. And some of us just prefer to go and fuck shit up. And that nothing about that is wrong. And in my view, nothing about that is wrong. Yes, there are other ways. I wouldn't call them better ways, other ways. But I have a really difficult time to say to somebody who's been oppressed their entire life, hey, your reaction to oppression, you shouldn't do that. Because we're not saying that same thing about the people who are oppressing them, right? We're not saying, Bernie Sanders, you represent an entitled class, and even though you wouldn't even particularly qualify as wealthy, it's still about $100,000 over the median income or the median net worth of a person your age, and you hold political office. Like, we're not doing that to him. We're letting him rest entirely on his good graces and what he's done well, which is fair, but we're only doing that because he's not us, because he's never been an us of any kind. He's been allowed to be Bernie Sanders.
I get what you're saying. I understand what you're saying. And don't get me wrong, I know what it's like to be backed in the corner. Sometimes, next thing you know, either you're gonna run or you're gonna bite. It's only two things you can do.
Exactly.
But we as black folk, we got, like Kendrick Lamar said, we gotta make time. We literally gotta make time. The judge make time. We gotta, both of us as fathers, we sit up here as fathers, we got kids. So the main things that I gotta do, I'm trying to teach my kids at a young age of how to handle problems a lot more strategically instead of going on.
Important is the education.
Yeah, not only my kids, I gotta help with his kids and the rest of the neighborhood's kids. These are the main things we should be doing right now, so we don't get to these parts where we flipping out. Like when John Lennon had those bed-ins, that had to take a lot of strategy for people to say, we ain't going to work, we gonna stay at home.
Right.
At the same time, I agree with what he's saying. It's a 50-50 with me, for the simple fact of, like you said, you can't really judge the person under the stress. You can't, because you're all gonna react. You go through the fight or flight instincts. Everybody has them. It's a natural, thing. But it's what to do after.
We gotta raise stronger people.
I mean, I think it's the education. I mean, if we really educated, really went back to education. I mean, we're talking about a separate separate education, an African education.
Your kids get out of school, they come over to somebody's house and they in the basement or on the porch learning.
But here's the thing, and again, I'm not saying this in contradiction. I really think we're having a conversation rather than a debate, and I appreciate that. But I don't. So I agree. But I want to be clear here, and this is again a clarification. I don't think it's an either or. But more than that, though, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. I don't have kids, but I have two brothers and a sister, and between all of them, I have 15 nephews and nieces. I took 6 of them out this past weekend to go swimming. We talk about politics all the time. On another podcast I have called Black Facts, where we just talk about what black means, what constitutes blackness, how that plays out, and opinions and all that other kinds of stuff, because we don't really talk about like the socio-political identity of blackness. We talk about whiteness all the time and have like comparisons to things that are white or not white, but we don't really talk about black in that same way. So those are my contributions to it. And in terms of education, well, I couldn't agree with you more as that being an important thing. But I think along with that, you don't have like righteous indignation without indignation. You don't have a social justice movement without a social movement, and you don't have a social movement without some violence. And in this case, the mildest of violence is just being rude or ungentlemanly. Like for me, it's such a mild offense. Particularly when you're considering what it's in response to is us being shot in the streets, us being shot in cars. So for them to go and take a microphone and calling that even rude and uncalled for me, it's like, I mean, it's like I'm trying not to think of something that's just too graphic, but I mean, it's such a mild anything in comparison. I do think that there are other things that need to be done, but education by itself is really, we can do it in terms of like my mom. She went out and she had 4 kids. She single mom. She worked all by herself. Bought a set of encyclopedias. We didn't get to watch TV, but 3 or 4 hours a week, and we learned by reading encyclopedias and asking questions and reading books, things like that. My mom made the effort. Good on her. But even that as a requirement for a particular group of people, just to be able to get to a place where they can then constitute a movement is overly burdensome. There needs to be a point where we say, yes, as an oppressive class, we have certain responsibilities if we want to get out. But more than that, we need to put the burden of effort on the oppressor and not the oppressed people. So when I look at us, when I look at Black people, in particular Black people are in, I don't blame other people and say, oh, well, it's the fault of this and that, whatever else. But at the same time, who has their boot on my neck? It's not my neighbor, and it's not because I didn't do enough push-ups to get him off of my neck. The fact that he has his boot on my neck in the first place is a problem. And if we don't have the focus on that, that for me is the offense. Like, yes, we should be doing push-ups so that the next time they step on us, we can throw them off. But bigger than that, they shouldn't be stepping on us in the first place. And when that's not the focus, I have a problem. It's in the same way I have a problem when you say to a young lady, look, if you don't dress sexy, you're less likely to get raped. Well, she should be able to dress however she wants and not have it be increasing her risk of rape at all. We should be saying to young men, you don't get to have sex with a woman without consent. For me, it's in that same vein. Right. So I'm not disagreeing with you at all. I fully agree that there are a lot of things that should be changed community-wise, but those are exacerbated not only by oppression, but by the sort of the psychological effects of oppression. Because it's not just like we're just like other people, except we're oppressed. There are a whole bunch of other things that come into play there.
People. I mean, you can look around the whole world. We ain't like other people. Our oppression is completely different than the rest of the world. I don't think a lot of us people even understand how different our oppression story is. You know, how the rest of the world benefits from our oppression. It ain't just,
that's what I mean about the education.
That's what we really want to educate people on. How is the oppressive class oppressing us?
You know, if that alone was more prevalent, if that was taught within the, like, okay, Black History Month, I hate it. It's the worst month ever for me. It always had. I grew up in a rural town in Ohio, predominantly. Mm-hmm. So just imagine the poison that I was fed during this time. It was just all slavery. Nothing great about it. Made you feel, you know. So, you know, it's a shame that I come into the knowledge of myself. You know, that's what it is, the knowledge of myself and where I come from. And at the age of 37 years old, still don't have the full story, but you know, I've been studying this for maybe about 5 years now, you know, and just the liberation that I have just from that subject alone is fantastic. So the issue goes back again. It's almost like we're in a state right now where, I don't know how old you are, but you seem to be about my age too, around what, about, you know, 35, 40 years old.
35, right on the nose.
Okay. So it seems like our generation is really getting a late start on really trying to figure this out. So, you know, this debate and, you know, slash turns into a conversation or whatever. We're in a situation right now where we are coming into knowledge that is late.
I think it's perfectly on time. And I don't mean to interrupt, but I think it's perfectly timed.
Perfectly timed?
So I'll say it very briefly. If you consider, right, I'm a fan, even though I don't agree with all of his stuff, I'm a fan of Derek Bell and Charles Mills. Derek Bell is a critical race theorist who looks at the civil rights movement and basically says it was a political catastrophe. We should have never tried to fight for equality in schools. We ended up screwing over a bunch of schools in Dorchester, Massachusetts, and really everything in the Northeast, and a bunch of schools in the South as well. We had all Black schools who were outperforming white schools in the area, and all we did instead was we just made it so that we could no longer have self-determination in that way. And in other ways too, he said, and even though, like I said, I don't necessarily agree with everything he said, but he said that the civil rights movement, the gains of the civil rights movement were largely political and not necessarily tangible in terms of socio-political identity or socio-political strength. And that's why you look at the 80s, 20 years after, and the 90s, 30 years after, and you don't see much change. We're still, Chef versus O'Neill is the perfect example of that. How we have a Chef versus O'Neill without, when we supposedly decided the thing twice. Now, it doesn't mean that no gains or relevant gains were made. What it means, though, is that the way we went about it in trying to get the powers that be to capitulate to at least what we thought they would be all right with us wanting, or what they defined as equality, right? Which means us being more like them or having access to their stuff. That was a problem. Instead of saying, we respect ourselves in this right and have carved out this area for ourselves, and now we own this identity and this is legit, right? Black wasn't even a thing that we picked. And I'm not calling you out, but just I'm saying to extrapolate. You said earlier on in the conversation, right, that was part of the problem, like even identifying blackness as a thing. And on a bit, like, I sort of agree, but understanding even where blackness came from, Black people, when we came to America, we came from, as you know, all different kinds of countries in Africa, and then from the West Indies and everything else. But Black people never called themselves Black. That was not a thing at all until it was taken, right? Black people were called Black after a time, even initially, right? During the first 150 years or so of slavery, you didn't call Black people Black. Negro was a generic, but you identified where slaves came from. They, at least in part, got to keep their language until chattel slavery really became full on. And then it just became Black. It became necessarily not white. So even the idea of tracing an identity was obliterated. And once after we had Black people freed, and then poor white people got more political power to separate them from poor Black people, so you didn't have a revolution, you had to have Black people, because what else did you have? Even if we decided in that, right, to become, you know what, I'm from this place, I'm from that place, to have our own identity, it would have murdered us to have separated ourselves out, right? And that's why I said in the conversation I had with you earlier that Black is necessarily unified. You cannot have Black identity without it being unified. It, by definition, it is. Right? Oh, and then, are we acting politically in the same way? Well, no, but it's.
If I talk to you, I'm gonna identify you as one of my Black brothers. But when it comes to law, and we identify ourselves in law, we can't sit there and trip that the system's against us, because the system is set up to be against people who identify themselves like that. It's straight up set up to be against people who identify themselves as that under law. Now, if you look through history, you had the Moors. Look at the Nation of Islam. They made sure they told you, like, quit getting your people beat up in the streets, and why don't you march down to that courthouse and get that name changed? That's why you also had Marcus Garvey. They had the Libyan movement. All of them, they were bent on making sure they had some kind of identity and some kind of nation backing them. And that's one thing that we don't have from the 60s. Things are we can tell. I can tell. My father was my father the other day, and he's saying that 60s spirit is coming back. You can see it.
That's why I say it's coming back.
You can feel it, but we ain't got that unity and that.
And that's why I think it's coming late, because if this would have happened 10 years ago, because you got that.
It would have been a disaster.
You have
10 years ago, it would have been a disaster.
You think?
Coming off of the heels of Clinton's successful liberal presidency, and then having a guy who had the most conservative power ever, who essentially was everything that he could be to be white supremacist that wasn't, and had 60-something% approval after white America got attacked. You think that at that point, if Black people decided to not be Black and to have the unified movement in 2005, there was nothing, we weren't allowed to be Black in 2005. The only thing that we had at that point was to not be American. That was it. If we had done this in 1985, now I agree with you there. But 2005?
Right, I got you.
We just got done dealing with 9/11.
Here's the thing, though. And I agree with you in terms of, like, when you say that the only reason that well, not even the only reason, that black people who identify as black by law have law against them. I agree. But we also have to tie to that blackness is not voluntary. It is an imposition. I can't, even as an individual or even as a group, I cannot go back and undo the socio-political imposition of blackness, right? Necessarily opposed to whiteness. If you have
powerful, you know, your melanin is powerful. I get that part.
But it's even more than that, though. It's even more than that. When we look at someone like, let's look at like Malcolm X, right? We do not talk about him as not black. Let's look at someone else, Lena Horne. We do not talk about her as not black. The sort of the socio-physical or physiological presentation of skin has never been blackness, right? What we've decided is black has changed over time, not because we created people with African ancestry or African or West Indian ancestry as enemies, but because whiteness requires blackness as opposition. Italians used to be black. Remember that? Irish used to be in the same category and had nothing to do with melanin. And then when it became politically expedient, basically after World War I, to have Italians be white, oh, they were sure as hell white. And the same thing with Irish. It had nothing to do with them being qualified as white. It had everything to do with them, oh, well, we need more white people. And I say the same thing, and I promise you now, when they're talking all this crap now about how, oh, by 2040, white people are going to be the minority. Well, no. We already have Latinos, who, by the way, aren't a racial category. It's not a racial category at all. It's an ethnic group who identify as white. You go to Brazil, you will find white Latinos. Spain, Mexico, the same thing. Those people in America right now are going to identify as white, and whiteness will accept them with open arms because it's going to be politically expedient for them to be so. And they'll get all the privileges of whiteness, while black, necessarily in opposition to white, that can never be white, will still be here. And the movement is not trying for equality in the way that they talk about it, but it's in dismantling the privileged group. It's in dismantling whiteness.
Yeah, but it's like
where do you start?
When you say like understanding even the word whiteness in a law term, that just means free person of citizenship. Like we're gonna start naming Italians and stuff. Like a white person is known as any free citizen of a nation. Now we can get knowing that not all of us came from Africa. Some of us is right here kicking it in America. They just enslaved us. You know what I'm saying? I got every last one. Everybody I know got some kind of indigenous roots. They can name Cherokees or Chippewas or Blackfoots or Apache. We got all that in our roots, so we have a lot of indigenous ties to this land. Now, I think of the words of Dr. Malachi York, how he, got himself together and got his little nation, and he had that appeal to the court, and he actually got that land from showing that he was indigenous to that land. Like that's political power to me. That's the things that I think we need to get.
1866 Native American, what was it, the Native American Freeman Act of 1866. That goes back to what you were saying about having the boot on your neck. That's also the whole education. It's centered around education. You got to let people know. No one knows what's going on in politics.
Right.
So, I mean, that's what I think is creating the frenzy of, the rioting and the bad behavior of things. But which really, I mean, it's a blessing in disguise is what it is. That's always what it turns out to be. But you got to admit, when you start to fight, it's because you're in fear of your life for some reason. You're in fear of something. You don't know what's going on. You're just going to act out.
I want to say, and this is again a point of clarification, and we're about 45 minutes into it, and I want to thank both of my guests, including the unexpected guests, who I'm going to give you a chance to introduce yourself as well. But I want to thank the both of you for being on. This is turning out to be much more enlightening than I expected it to be, and I really did truly expect it to be enlightening. But I want to clarify something you were talking about earlier about whiteness. So as a point of information, my last 3 years of study have been social justice and all that kind of stuff, and racial justice, but in particular studying race and what race means, what constitutes race, and how it plays out in terms of public policy. And in the next year or so, I'm hoping to go and pursue my PhD and do research in that. But whiteness, other than any other race, or more than any other racial category, does not have any root in any definition. We think it does, and we talk about it in terms all the time, colloquially and otherwise, that it means something, right? We say, oh, Italians are white. Well, they are for now, right? Because the only thing that white is what is not white. But white itself is not a thing that has ever been static, right? Italians were not white, and then they became not white. And so we call them white, but well, they weren't really. They're just not white anymore. And the category of whiteness is necessarily ambiguous because it's a class of privilege. So you don't want anybody to be able to put on whiteness. The Japanese, after the Immigration Act or Naturalization Act of 1796, they tried to be white, and they made a lot of biological arguments for it, right? We had Indians from India making arguments about how they were literally Caucasian and presented phenotypically as white. None of those things passed muster. Not one of those things, and went all the way to the Supreme Court, ever got by with them being white, even though they looked white and they were from white places. And why? Because white is not what we think white is. White is only what white isn't. Or white is what isn't not white. So that's why when you talk about people who aren't white, you can say people of color, right? That's everything that isn't white. I mean, think about it. We don't have another category for anyone who isn't black. We don't have a category for anything else.
As European citizens, Europeans that came to America, they get classified as white. No, but I guess if you got an intense amount of melanin, they're not going to classify you as white.
There's still people who are classified as white, though. Osama bin Laden, by the census definition, is a white man.
Wow.
I'm dead serious. Yeah, Osama bin Laden is not brown. That is a white man. If you get enough, you know what? Dead serious. You go look up his country of origin, and then you compare it to the census. If he came into America, he would be white.
Right.
Because again, like white is that. And I'm not saying this to overtalk you, and I apologize. But I'm trying to talk about in terms of like how ambiguous race is. The problem is we talk about it in a way colloquially we understand it. So yeah, if we saw Osama bin Laden, we wouldn't discuss him as white. Of course we wouldn't. But legally, that's a completely different story. There are the legal understandings and definitions of whiteness, which have been borne out in the last 300 or so years in the Supreme Court, well, 200 something years. And then we have the social definition of whiteness, which plays out in different ways, right? Italians became white, not legally, but socially they became white. Same with the Irish. Legal definition of whiteness did not change to accommodate that. And then colloquially, how we understand it in regionally. So I know that I can't ever be white because of the way that I look. And when we discuss race, regionally, we discuss it in terms of phenotype, how you look. But all three of those things apply at the same time, and all three of those things are constantly changing. So in order for us to even be talking about a thing, we're necessarily talking about a moving target. Like Africans who come to America are like, they can be white or black depending, and then also they're black, but they're also African, even though blacks we can call African. It doesn't, we talk about it as if there's a standard definition, and there isn't. There is no this us versus this them. And that is, you said, but what is the first thing we do? Well, the first thing we do is get rid of the bullshit of racial categories and understand them as, number one, an imposition, and number two, something we straight up made up. It is not indicative at all of biology. It is not indicative or descriptive properly in any way of ancestry. It is a socio-political burden placed on people who are not in any way, have access to the privileged class. So when we talk about whiteness and we talk about white ancestry and white culture, we're really talking about the group of people who we have arbitrarily given access to the machineries of politics and power, and everyone who isn't that, who's been denied it. And that is the most difficult part of the conversation. Not in having black people get together, because we only know who is white by identifying everyone who isn't. I mean, that, and think on that for a minute, because it's a true statement.
Yeah,
It's
right.
Because we have people who look super white. The guy in Plessy versus Ferguson looked white. If you look at him, that was a white man. He was 1/8 black.
We just got done talking about Clark Gable. He looked white.
Yeah.
Rachel
There's so many other people who would be black, and that's with the blood quantum nonsense of like, oh, if you have any black blood in you, you're black. Well, not really, because in the Northeast it wouldn't count that way, but in Louisiana it certainly, and it still counts that way. The way you qualify yourself as black in Louisiana, it still is based on blood quantum, that's not at all scientific. It's just not. We used to understand race to be a thing that we talked about in the same way that we talk about nationality. It's an artificial thing that we just place on people.
Yeah,
but at some point we started talking about it as biology, so that we can, or not some of it. White people started talking about it as a biological reality, so that they could justify things like chattel slavery.
Right.
That's the only reason we start talking about it as biological at all. And then we bought into it, and I mean we, all of us, because we started making arguments against it as us as persons. Black people weren't thought of as lazy in the beginning. They were the way that we talk about black people now, that was not the way we talked about it at all, right? They were sickly and servile and all this. And then when that proved not to be true, once black people were freed, they were menacing and threatening and overly sexualized and dangerous. The exact opposite of what before then.
Right.
Absolutely.
It's arbitrary.
Hey man, we're about almost out of time, man. But I want to get your email, man.
He's on there. I already put him through.
Oh, you already got it?
He already on your Hangouts and everything.
Let me say this. Let me say this real fast. So one, add me on Facebook, and number two, I'd love to have a more structured conversation around this. This is a show, Politifunk, where I often have other people on. You guys made my night. Thank you very much. I also have a show called.
Yeah.
Pardon?
No, I'm just, I'm a face-to-face person. That's why at the end of the day, I was like, I'm done typing. I'll talk. I'll call you. I'll come. We get tea or coffee, man.
Man, I appreciate you. I do.
Folks are gonna get it together. We need to get together and talk face-to-face, look at each other's souls. So, I would let you know who I was as a person too.
I appreciate you. Listen, I have a show called Black Facts, which is the other podcast I run. It's a little more casual than this, and this is hella casual, obviously. But I'd love to have you guys on. And in that show, and rather than talking about political issues per se, we talk about how we understand blackness to be, what we understand, because it's not a thing that we really ever talk about. And what I hope to do, from years or so from now, or a year or so from now, is to really investigate the meaning of the actual, if there's a tangible meaning of race, in particular blackness, what does that mean? And socioculturally, how that plays out. Like, how can I be black and you be black, and we've never met, and we know nothing of one another at all culturally, but we immediately identify? White people don't do that.
Right.
They don't ever. If you got like Taylor Swift and Robert De Niro in the same place, and you told them they shared a culture, they'd laugh at you. There's no way. But me and you necessarily share one. Now, why is that? That's the thing that I'm curious about. It's not to say that I don't think black people should be unified or see each other as one. But at the same time, that's some bullshit.
I got you.
I just told everybody, I said, what do cuckoo buds in the kitchen mean? And it's only a certain type of people who understand that language.
Exactly, man. Exactly. Listen, I know you said we're coming up on the end, and it's 10 p.m. I'd like to thank both of my guests, both of you, for being on the show. Honestly, I have to have you guys back on. This was a million times more than I ever really expected, and certainly was a lot more progressive or a lot more productive than I ever. And I really expected it to be a positive conversation, and ended up being well beyond my expectations. So thank the both of you for spending time. Especially, I had to put it off for an hour, and I apologize for that. I ended up double booking myself. Certainly, add me again on Facebook or wherever else you can. I'm.
Hey, how you know Tim? How you know Tim?
So Tim is a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend, and we ended up making friends through Facebook. And then I went down and I saw him. I saw a show of his a little while ago and cemented the friendship He is super hilarious.
Funny
and,
as, funny as.
He's super funny.
I've done comedy with him, so yeah. All right. Well,
yeah,
anytime
I've seen him stand up before I even met him, and it turned out he was a friend of mine on Facebook, and I'd seen his stand up for a couple of years now, and I never met him. So when I friended him on Facebook, I'm like, oh, I'm a fan of yours, even though he was a friend of mine, and he didn't believe me, so I started quoting his jokes back to him.
Nice.
But yeah, I'm just gonna, in the way of quickly wrapping up, thank the both of you for showing up. I'm looking forward to having you both on in the future. For those of you watching, Politifunk is sort of back. I'm still crazy busy. I have, as I mentioned in other episodes, I have the novel and I have a new job and I have a wedding to plan and all this other kind of stuff. But I promise you, if I go away for more than a week or so, I will most certainly be back. I'm going to redouble my efforts and make sure that we stay on the air and keep talking about things because it's relevant. And we're coming into an election year, and I can't wait for that. Thank you for joining us on Politifunk.
Comedy. That's ADAT Comedy on Instagram and Twitter. Thank you guys very much, man. Have a wonderful day. Peace, bless, and hotep.
All of that. ADAD Comedy. Write that down right. ADAT?
Yeah, comedy.
AD as in dog, AT as in time. Comedy.
I will post it in the comments. Take care.
There you go. Post that in the comments. It's also going to be on YouTube. So when you go ahead and go to YouTube and get the link, you can just go ahead and post that in there. We'll make sure that happens. Gentlemen, thank you. I'm going to go and have myself a beer.
All right,
Deuces.